Greetings, this is Greg. The de Havilland Mosquito was one of the best planes of World War II. The Mosquito was so good that, as sometimes happens with legendary airplanes, myths rise up around them, exaggerating their capabilities. The same sort of thing happened with the P-51 Mustang, as well as a few others. I think the Mosquito's biggest myth is that the Allies could have used them to replace B-17 Flying Fortresses and won the war just as quickly, but with far fewer casualties. But this is not true. The myth goes something like this. The Mosquito can carry the same bomb load as a B-17, and because it's so fast and only has a crew of 2 instead of 10, it can do the same job as the B-17 and do it much more efficiently. As Mosquitoes had very low loss rates, many lives would have been saved. Well, absolutely not. The people making this argument have a lack of understanding, not only about aircraft and aircraft payloads, but more importantly, about the very goal and purpose of the U.S. Army Air Force over Europe during the war. However, as with most myths, this one did develop out of some truths. The Mosquito can carry a 4,000-pound bomb load. That's absolutely true. But there are some very important qualifiers here. First of all, not all Mosquitoes can carry a 4,000-pound bomb load. It has to be a version with bulged bomb bay doors and no machine guns or cannons. Not just any Mosquito, but one specifically built or converted for this purpose. Mosquitoes were built by Australians, British, and Canadians. It appears that none of the ones built by Australians or Canadians were built to carry the 4,000-pound bomb load. And of the British-built Mosquitoes, I can only count 327 out of the approximately 7,800 Mosquitoes built that could carry this payload. Now, because some planes were built one way and then converted, it's unclear what the actual total is, but probably less than 500 examples. Thus, the vast majority of Mosquitoes were not configured and equipped to carry a 4,000-pound bomb load. Now, of those that could, what type of bomb load are we looking at? It's a very specific bomb load, a single 4,000-pound cookie bomb. The cookie is a weapon with massive explosive power, but the downside is that it's pretty close to unaimable. It's essentially a non-aerodynamic barrel with no fins to stabilize it. It required a minimum altitude of 6,000 feet, about 1,800 meters for a drop, and was considered a dangerous payload to carry as they would sometimes detonate prematurely when released. Of course, the British knew what they were doing, and they knew that the cookie bomb, while a useful weapon, was the wrong choice for the majority of bombing missions, which is why so few Mosquitoes were equipped to carry it. The B-17 Flying Fortress's maximum internal bomb load is 12,800 pounds, so no, the Mosquito can't carry more, it's not even close, and the B-17's internal payload is made up of bombs which can be aimed well enough to hit specific targets like factories from altitude. Of course, you can come up with an apples to oranges comparison to make it appear as if both planes carry nearly the same bomb load. The easiest and most common way to do that is with a Mosquito carrying a cookie bomb on a night mission with a number of planes flying individually, and compare that to B-17s flying a daylight mission in a large group. In that situation, then yes, both planes will take about 4,000 pounds to Berlin. The B-17 needs a lot of extra fuel to assemble into a formation and then fly a zigzag course to the target to complicate German efforts to amass a force of fighters to intercept them. Even so, the B-17's average bomb load to Berlin was about 4,600 pounds. For reference, here is a bomb load versus range chart for the B-17. Berlin was about 550 miles from the B-17 bases in England, so about 1,100 miles round trip. Looking at the chart, it would appear that the plane could take around 12,000 pounds of bombs. The reality is that with the extra fuel needed to get into formation, the non-direct routing, and the performance requirements for flying in formation, much lower bomb loads were carried. Another part of the reason for the lower bomb load was the type of bombs needed for the mission. The maximum internal load of 12,800 pounds was via 8 1,600-pound bombs. Often for the types of targets being bombed in Germany, it was more desirable to carry a larger number of smaller bombs to increase coverage of the target, but that reduces the weight of the load. It was the same with the Mosquito. It could carry 4 500-pound bombs internally, or a single 4,000-pound cookie, and often more smaller bombs was the better choice, even though it reduced the payload in terms of weight. Anyway, it's true. The Mosquito could carry a 4,000-pound bomb to Berlin, and it's true that B-17s usually carried 4,600 pounds to Berlin. So sure, if you're talking about one specific version of the Mosquito and compare a night raid, a non-precision raid, to a daylight raid to a distant target like Berlin, then the Mosquito's payload is pretty close. However, in most missions, it's not that close, and the B-17 can carry much more, about twice as much. Still, it is close in some specific cases. So one might say, why not send hundreds of Mosquitoes to a single city at night, each one dropping a 4,000-pound cookie? The problem then becomes bombing accuracy. The U.S. heavy bombers in Europe were primarily targeting factories, marshalling yards, oil production, and airfields. In other words, pretty specific things. The standard for accuracy for the USAAF was based on a 1,000-foot circle from the center of the target. About 20% of the bombs dropped from the heavies at altitude would hit within this circle. While 20% doesn't sound like a lot, it does represent a whole lot of destruction. Furthermore, that other 80% of the bombs often hit nearby the target, taking out supporting infrastructure, roads, rail lines to the factory, killing factory workers that live nearby, and generally having a detrimental effect on the target. At first glance, the British accuracy statistics look a lot better, 38% of their bombs on target versus 20. However, the target in the case of the RAF missions is the entire city. While a Mosquito dropping cookies at night could kill a lot of people, mostly civilians in this case, it was not likely to take out a specific target like a factory. Thus, it's not just about tonnage. Even if the tonnage was the same, a Mosquito flying at night cannot achieve the same level of destruction on specific targets as a formation of B-17s can in the daytime. Of course, Mosquitoes could fly in the daytime, but getting them to a target in Germany in large numbers in the daylight would not have been practical. In fact, Mosquitoes initially suffered very high loss rates during daylight operation, higher than losses of the Bristol Blenheim, which for a short time did some real damage to this idea of an unarmed fast bomber. Of course, the problem was not with the Mosquito, but with the way it was initially used. Then they switched to night or intruder type operations, and the Mosquito loss rates went way down. The Mosquito was very difficult to intercept when flying at night, or even in the daytime when flying in small numbers down below enemy radar. That's very different from trying to get hundreds of planes onto a distant target in the daylight. However, this entire discussion, the idea that the Mosquito could have replaced the B-17, is fatally flawed before it even gets out of the gate because it assumes incorrectly that the primary mission of the U.S. Army Air Force in Europe was to drop some large amount of bomb tonnage on targets. It was not. The mission from mid-1943 and on was primarily to destroy the Luftwaffe, not specifically to put bomb tonnage on targets. Dropping bombs was simply a means to an end. At the Trident Conference in May of 1943, the plans were made for the Allied cross-channel invasion of Europe. A list was made of various things that had to happen before the invasion could take place. Step one involved the big picture stuff, like supporting the Soviets on the Eastern Front, a combined U.S. and British bombing offensive, and a naval blockade. The second item was to establish air superiority. As seen in this document from the U.S. War Department and sent out by the Secretary of War, the requirements of the Trident Conference were clearly interpreted as a directive to destroy the Luftwaffe. It specifically says, attack them in the air, on the ground, and to attack enemy installations required for the application of air power. That means destroying the Luftwaffe was the highest priority for the U.S. Army Air Force in Europe. That makes sense because while at the time the British certainly had air superiority over Britain, and the Germans had it at least in the daytime over some parts of Germany, but there was a lot of contested area in between. What's worse is that in 1942, the Luftwaffe had demonstrated their ability to gain air superiority over areas of their choosing for short periods of time, possibly long enough to disrupt a cross-channel invasion. For example, the Luftwaffe established air superiority over the English Channel during the famous Channel Dash of 1942. The Kriegsmarine got a number of ships from Brest past the coast of Normandy, through the English Channel, and all the way to ports in Germany, with no ships lost and only some light damage to the fleet. Then in August of 1942, British and Canadian forces landed at Dieppe. In spite of a massive RAF effort to stop them, the Luftwaffe made a very strong showing and contributed to the failure of this Allied assault. So the importance of destroying the Luftwaffe prior to the Allied invasion of Normandy was very clear, which is why it was so high on the list of things to do from the Trident Conference and why the U.S. Secretary of War made it a top priority. The Mosquito, although a great airplane, simply cannot do that. It cannot destroy the Luftwaffe by flying in at night at low level and dropping a 4,000-pound cookie on some German city. How many planes and pilots are the Luftwaffe going to lose because of that? How much damage will be done to the German aircraft industry? Very little in both cases. On the other hand, the Luftwaffe suffered huge losses battling the U.S. Army Air Force in the daytime. We often talk about the losses of U.S. four-engine bombers, especially while unescorted, which they often were in 1943. What's not often mentioned is that the Luftwaffe was also losing a lot of planes and pilots to the B-17's gunners. The trade-off was pretty close to 1-to-1, which means the Luftwaffe was trading a single or twin-engine airplane for a four-engine heavy bomber. The German fighters would have a crew of 1 or 2 men. They might parachute to safety and fight another day. The U.S. would lose 10 men because even if they bailed out and survived, they would almost certainly be captured. However, the U.S. Army Air Force could afford the losses and recover from them. The Luftwaffe couldn't. And as time went on, the U.S. losses went down, primarily because of the increased use of escort fighters and the more aggressive U.S. fighter tactics under Jimmy Doolittle. Luftwaffe losses went up, and by D-Day in June of 1944, the Luftwaffe was so crippled it wasn't able to effectively interfere with the Allied invasion, not even close. That happened because of the Luftwaffe's losses dealing with the USAAF heavy bombers. That's not to say that the British or Soviet efforts didn't help. Of course, they contributed to what was a combined effort. But the tipping point for the Luftwaffe was reached when the U.S. ramped up its bombing campaign combined with escorting fighters. As you can see on this chart, the Germans were losing a lot of airplanes going up against the U.S. bombers, even unescorted. The bombers were taking their toll. Of course, the numbers for enemy fighters shot down by bombers was falsely high because these are claims, not confirmed kills. Usually, multiple gunners were shooting at the same airplane and they would all claim the same kill. However, there is a line on this chart that tries to take all that into account. It's hard to see, so I'll put an arrow on it. The next chart shows that from mid-1943, about the time the U.S. bombing efforts were really ramping up, the Luftwaffe put the majority of their assets on the Western Front. As compared with the Eastern Front, twice as many single-engine fighters and 10 times more twin-engine fighters. This disparity increased from then on. This is important because people often say the war was won on the Eastern Front. Maybe it was, but not the air war. From June of 1943, German losses on the Western Front started to increase massively as the U.S. bombers and escorts were starting to push farther and farther east. Soon, Luftwaffe losses on the Western Front far exceeded those on the Eastern Front, and that trend continued for the rest of the war. This resulted in the Luftwaffe losing pilots faster than they could be replaced. This chart shows that in the first 5 months of 1944, the months leading up to D-Day, the Germans lost about 20% of their pilots in any given month. They simply ran out of experienced pilots. They were killed off by the U.S. escort fighters, and to a lesser extent, but still to an extent that matters, by the U.S. bomber gunners. Not to mention the fact that their aircraft factories, oil supply, rail yards, airfields, ball bearing plants, and just about anything else that supported aviation was being bombed constantly. This forced German industry to go into caves and forests, reducing quality, especially of their aircraft. In short, by June of 1944, the Luftwaffe was unable to oppose the D-Day invasion in any remotely meaningful way. This happened because the Luftwaffe had to fly in the daytime against formations of U.S. four-engine bombers, which enabled the U.S. escort fighters to engage them, destroy them, and kill their pilots. Without the four-engine heavies, there was really no way to ensure the Luftwaffe would go up in the daytime against U.S. fighters. Sure, the U.S. fighters could fly in and strafe their bases and damage some planes, and that was done, but that tactic does not kill a lot of pilots. Now, I suppose one might argue that we could have sent in formations of mosquitoes, but that wasn't the way mosquitoes were operated, and with good reason. A formation of them at altitude going deep into Germany would be easy to intercept and shoot down, especially if they're going beyond the range of escort fighters. Also, they can't hit a specific target with a cookie from high altitude, so they would likely have to carry a reduced load of 2,000 pounds, which would then reduce the effectiveness of their bombing. The Mosquito bombers were used in the right way, at least for most of the war. There were some high losses early on when operating in the daytime. However, flying in low, and especially flying in low at night, a Mosquito bomber was close to impossible to stop and could put a 4,000-pound bomb in the middle of the city at night. However, that was not going to break the Luftwaffe, and certainly not in time for the D-Day invasion. The Mosquito was a great airplane, but was not capable of replacing the B-17. As for the argument that using Mosquitoes would have saved lives, I think that's based on a false premise as well. Let's say the Mosquitoes could have destroyed the Luftwaffe. I don't see how, but let's say that they could. I think we can agree that it would have taken longer to destroy the Luftwaffe. Well, how much longer? We tend to forget the scale of death and destruction in World War II. Yes, the U.S. lost a lot of airmen in those four-engine bombers. Roughly 30,000 U.S. airmen lost their lives during this bombing campaign. And yes, had they used Mosquitoes, this number would have been lower. But does that mean the loss of life would have been lower? No. It means more people would have been killed, just different people. About 16 to 20,000 people were killed every day during the war in Europe. So if D-Day, and thus the end of the war, was delayed by only 2 days, then statistically the additional loss of life would likely exceed all the deaths of U.S. crew members on the four-engine heavies during the entire bombing campaign over Europe. I hate to end these videos on such a downer, but sometimes that's history. Thanks for watching. That's all for now. Goodbye, and have a great day.